Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Today we are going to be talking, unfortunately, about what I think is one of the greatest disasters in human history, and it is the meltdowns of the nuclear reactors at Fukushima, Japan, that happened in March of this year. And nobody's talking about it, which is, the media's not talking about it, the politicians are not talking about it, which is why we are going to be talking about it. Our guest today is Werner Simbeck. Werner is a mechanical engineer, and he's at least looked into this issue a little more than most of us, and he has some education and background in what's going on. And as I said, I think I'm afraid that this is one of the greatest disasters in human history, and that's exactly why it's being kept quiet. So, Werner, you said that you actually live in Canada because of a previous nuclear disaster, which was Chernobyl, that I think you said happened in 1986?
That's right. That's right. It's kind of interesting how these things seem to unfold. When my parents were interested in moving to Canada, but they weren't really sure if that's what they wanted to do, because it's a big step, taking your two children and moving to another country that they really loved. But so they applied, and they had to go ahead from the Canadian government to come, but they weren't sure yet. And then Chernobyl happened. Chernobyl happened in '86, March of '86. And in March of '87, we were in Victoria.
And you're from Germany, I guess.
We're from southern Germany, yeah, that's right.
Now, when Chernobyl happened, for years afterward, I remember reading, the only little media you ever got was that nothing really happened. 39 people died. I remember that was the number that was repeated to us over and over and over again.
Yeah.
But obviously there was a lot more to it than that.
Yeah. Well, with Chernobyl, one should remember it was one nuclear reactor that had a meltdown. Now, Fukushima recently had 3 nuclear reactors that were side by side who had a meltdown. And then there was a 4th nuclear reactor that had problems with the cooling pool. I'll get to that later. So coming back to Chernobyl in '86, somebody ran an experiment unauthorized, and it caused a huge problem, and basically the reactor blew up. It released a very large amount of radioactive material, and just unfortunate, just the way it was, the wind turned basically 360 degrees during the first few days and then weeks after the accident. So it spread the radiation sort of with a broad brush over Europe. And the Russians didn't say anything for about 2 weeks. And I'm not sure, I think it was Swedish scientists who picked this up first. And they raised the alarm bell. They were measuring high radiation concentrations, and then that same thing was repeated in other European countries, and they basically were asking, well, where could this come from? And eventually Gorbachev, who was the president of Russia at that point, declared to the world that they had a nuclear accident in Chernobyl. At that point in time, that was, then I guess later, as we understood, it was there's a scale from 1 to 7, I believe, and this was rated to be a 7, the highest possible level of accident you can have with a nuclear power plant. So it contaminated all of Europe. A lot of people don't know that's how severe it was, and it's still radioactive. I was just there in Germany just in May last year, visiting friends. Anyways, so this fellow who I went to elementary school with, his father is a hunter, and he became a hunter too. And being a hunter is something actually it's not easy to get a hunting license, and once you have it, it's quite prestigious to have that. So his father still goes out hunting on a regular basis with people that, well, often nobility in Europe actually, those are the ones who can afford doing this sort of sport. And when they shoot wild boars in Germany, they have to be tested to see how high the radiation level is, because wild boars eat mushrooms, and mushrooms are known to be concentrating radiation. So wild boars in Germany, when they're being shot, they have to be tested first to see if they're fit for human consumption. And this is now 20 years later. So, and when the accident happened, and I was in Germany just in my school that I went to, I remember so vividly that the PE teacher, together with the physics teacher that we had were running around with the only Geiger counter on campus, so to speak. This rather heavy piece of lab equipment, not really meant to be mobile. So the PE teacher was dragging a long 100-meter extension cord behind, and the physics teacher was measuring radiation in the yard and on the playground, and in the sort of on the soccer field that we were normally playing on. And they were measuring such high levels that we weren't allowed to go outside anymore.
Now it's 25 years later.
Yeah.
How many people, I've read or heard that hundreds of thousands of people have died because of Chernobyl, died because they got sick or they got cancer or their parts of their body were damaged from the radiation release from Chernobyl. Is that correct?
Well, I personally don't know if it's correct, but there was a book released not very long ago by the Academy of Science in New York, where the authors gathered 5,000 different studies, peer-reviewed studies from Eastern Europe dealing with this issue. And when you add up all the numbers, you get to 1 million people that have died since Chernobyl.
Because of?
Because of the results of the release of the radiation, and because the radiation stays in the food chain for a very long time. It accumulates, especially so if you were to drink the milk from a cow, that is already accumulated much heavier in concentration because a cow is higher up on the food chain. So infants are very susceptible to radiation, and they then develop thyroid cancer and other cancers that come later in life. Cancer takes anywhere from 5 to 60 years to develop. So,
and I'm sure it's not only cancer. I'm sure that you don't want radiation in your body for 1 million different reasons.
Yes, there is cesium. Cesium is actually a potassium analog. The body thinks it's potassium. And I think every gardener knows potassium goes everywhere. I mean, in your garden, use it as a fertilizer, right? Together with nitrogen. So the cesium accumulates in plants just as if it was potassium. And so you take it up in food. So, plant eaters, so cows would eat it, or we get the lettuce from the garden, or you get lettuce from the farm, or carrots from the farm, or potatoes from the farm. It has that in it. Now, cesium has as an example, cesium has a half-life. You often hear this. Well, it's a radioisotope, has a half-life of 30 years. So you think, well, it's 25 years, so, hopefully, in 5 years' time, all the cesium is gone. Well, it says half-life. That means only 50% of it will be gone, will disappear. So that means you still have 50% left. Normally, the rule of thumb is that you take the half-life and you multiply by 10. So in case of cesium, it would be 30 years times 10. That means 300 years. That means cesium will affect Europe for 300 years. Slowly over the years diminishing, but nevertheless it's still there in the environment. And with the example of the wild boars in Germany, most of them can't be eaten. So
this is a very serious and dangerous situation. We probably should have moved completely away from nuclear power after Chernobyl, and no doubt even before Chernobyl, but we didn't. And it's very interesting that here in North America we were fed the usual pack of lies that said nobody died because of Chernobyl, 39 people, it's safe, forget about it, don't think about it, and the media and the politicians never even mentioned it. And so, because there's money to be made, this is big business. Some of the biggest corporations in the world are involved in the nuclear power industry, and many, many wealthy corporations and powerful people have a lot of money invested in nuclear power, and they intend to keep it going, which they are doing. So now, at the beginning of this year, in March 2011, we had another and even more dangerous nuclear disaster in Fukushima because of the earthquake followed by the tsunami. So can you just say what happened at Fukushima?
Well, I think most people have seen the footages of the gigantic tsunami coming on shore in Japan after they had this massive earthquake. And, it was quite obvious this was a very devastating event. Of course, then the next thing we heard that there were some problems at a nuclear power plant. And it was, I think for most people who know a little bit about this technology, that it is quite susceptible to earthquakes. You know, they're not, this is a very highly sophisticated piece of equipment. There's thousands of pipes and thousands of electrical connections and sensors. They all have to work properly in order for this piece of kit to work, in order for this nuclear power plant to run properly. So, you know, so when there was an earthquake and then there was a gigantic tsunami, no surprise there might be some problems with the nuclear power plant. But then the biggest problem was that they lost power. And by losing power, they lost cooling. And so to understand how nuclear power, how it all works, so what we do, we take some uranium, we enrich it with 235, not to really go into the details, but we refine uranium. And I know Iran is in the papers all the time nowadays because they're enriching uranium, but they're only enriching it to make fuel for nuclear reactors. So when you enrich uranium and then you stuff it into these small little metal tubes and you put them in close proximity to each other, they start a little chain reaction. And that chain reaction produces a lot of heat because we're breaking apart the atoms of a uranium, a 235 atom. So neutrons does that. A neutron stream is created and it breaks up these uranium atoms and it produces heat in the process. So it gets pretty hot. So what do we do with hot things? Well, we stick them in water, right? We boil water that way to make hot water for tea. So basically a nuclear power reactor, all it is just a gigantic teapot in some ways. You know, we're just producing a lot of heat and we're taking it away with water. And that water gets so hot that we then can run a steam turbine at the other end of that.
And create electricity.
So, which is fantastic. I mean, that part works really well. When the cooling isn't there anymore, when you can't run pumps to keep the reactor cool, that's when things fall apart. And really the danger, see, if it wasn't for the radiation, I think this would be a great technology. I think everyone should have one in their backyard, basically, you know. But because of the problems with the radiation contamination and the toxicity of the fuel that's being used, that's where the problems start. So remember I said cesium had a half-life of 30 years? Uranium, for example, has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. That's billion with a B. Right? And when you have to sort of think about that for a moment and go, 4.5 billion years. Oh, but the argument is it's mildly radioactive. You don't have to worry about it. It's not really a big deal. I mean, it comes from the Earth, so, you know, it's probably okay. But when it gets really hot and it becomes so hot that it starts melting, and then you have gigantic explosions because of hydrogen buildup, as we then, I think some people who may have seen the footages on TV that they did show that these reactors got so hot, the power didn't come on, the generators that was to produce the power didn't work because of the gigantic tsunami. These things became so hot that they start making hydrogen. That's just sort of a side product because of the materials they use to make these little tubes. And they got thousands of these tubes that have the uranium pellets in there, the enriched uranium pellets. What it does is it creates hydrogen, and then hydrogen becomes so concentrated that it just self-ignites. With the right combination of heat and hydrogen and a mixture of oxygen, you have there were 3 explosions in 3 different reactors.
And this was followed by meltdowns.
That's correct.
And if anybody, I mean, meltdowns used to be something they talked about only in the most hushed of terms. That would never happen, but if there was a meltdown, it would be a disaster. We now had 3 at Fukushima, and nobody's talking about it, as if it never happened. But when it melts down, it actually gets so hot that it burns through the entire factory and the concrete and goes into the...
So you have a meltdown and then you have a melt-through. They've had melt-throughs. So the vessels that contains the fuel to create the heat, that they were all breached, all 3 of them. First they said, you know, this is a level 3, then it was a level 4, then a level 5 on the scale, on this international scale of how you measure nuclear accidents. And it took 2 months to finally say, well, it was a level 7, it was on par with Chernobyl. But still saying that it's under control, we have it under wraps, it's not a big deal, you know, and The wind was blowing, you know, from west to east, so it was blowing onto the Pacific Ocean. So, you know, Japan was more or less in good shape. So at least it appeared, you know, in the press. And then that, you know, they had people, firefighters, move in and provide, because the cooling, they couldn't repair the cooling. There was so much damage from the explosions and then from the tsunami first and then the explosions. The last resort was to try to cool these reactors. These melted down and then melted through reactor cores by dumping seawater. Seawater, you know, was dumped on this highly sophisticated piece of kit. You'd never put seawater because it's very corrosive. That means you basically already that's the last option that you have left in your box of tricks.
So all of this nuclear material is now basically blown open, and it's sitting somewhere under where the reactors were to begin with.
That's correct.
And there have been explosions. There has been, I think, a huge release of nuclear or of radioactive materials. Mm-hmm. It's now, this happened in March, so April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. We're looking at 9 months later. Mm-hmm. Is it still emitting radiation?
Yes, it is, but not as much as it used to be. It used to in the first couple of weeks, I suppose. You know, the things that were airborne, that were basically thrown into the atmosphere, that happened really in the first 2 to 3 weeks. The majority of that, I suppose, maybe in the first couple of months. Now it has sort of reduced that amount of emissions, basically because the raging, I don't want to say fire, but the melted cores aren't quite as hot anymore as they were. So the salt water that they've been dumping on has helped in trying to sort of control this out of control scenario. But what they've had is that all this water that they used to cool this became extremely radioactive. The nuclear power plant sits right next to the Pacific Ocean. Guess where all the water goes? It goes straight into the ocean. They had leaks for months now, and they always find new leaks. But of course, you don't hear about this in the mainstream media at all. I know they've tried to introduce filtering systems now where they're trying to filter out the radioactive material out of the water that they use for cooling. But it just they keep having problems, and it keeps spills into the Pacific Ocean. I mean, Greenpeace, if you go on their website and you look under Fukushima to read the latest updates, because they have boats actually in Japan where they're measuring the radiation levels. They've been measuring radiation levels that just have never been seen before. This is the worst release or the worst human-made catastrophe, nuclear catastrophe, since the beginning of the nuclear age. We don't have anything to compare this to anything that has happened in the past. All the nuclear tests that were performed are, in comparison to this accident, small potatoes.
I've heard that too. I don't understand it. All the nuclear bombs that were blown up in tests, and there were dozens at least, if not hundreds, mm-hmm. is less radiation given off than from this.
The way to understand it is this. So in order to make a nuclear bomb, and I'm not necessarily an expert, I'm just reading and listening to experts off the field. But to make a nuclear bomb, like for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they used about 5 kilograms worth of enriched uranium or plutonium. A nuclear reactor, a single nuclear reactor at Fukushima produces 500 pounds, so 250 kilograms of plutonium a year.
Say that again?
250 kilograms of plutonium is made in a nuclear reactor a year, per year. They've been running for 40 years.
Of plutonium?
Plutonium. Plutonium is a side product of a nuclear fission process.
Now, I've heard that plutonium is the most dangerous substance anywhere.
It's definitely one of the most toxic materials that we've ever created. That's correct.
I didn't know that it was 250 kilograms
per year.
Per year
per
of
reactor.
Plutonium.
That's correct.
What is the half-life of plutonium?
24,000 years.
And this has now been blown into the atmosphere as well, I guess.
Absolutely, sure. And into the ocean, right? And of course, people in Japan are mostly affected. You know, we are about, 8,000 kilometers away from Japan. You know, we're downwind though. and downstream, so to speak, because now they're talking about in the media, and they did talk about that, all this debris that was washed off the shore from the tsunami. So the tsunami washed on shore and then ripped all kinds of things with it as it returned back into the ocean. So there's this gigantic debris field that is about to wash up on the west coast of Canada as well as the United States.
What is the price that is going to be paid by people? I mean, in Japan, no doubt it's a real disaster. There's been evacuations. I think 20,000 people were moved permanently away. They're living in camps or...
No, it's kind of interesting. So Japan, the government in Japan, they reacted very slowly to this accident. And I suppose one can argue they were overwhelmed. There was just too many things going on. There was a gigantic earthquake, an unbelievable large tsunami, and a nuclear meltdown. I mean, that things would fall apart, I wouldn't be surprised. What I was surprised is that they didn't ask for help at all. I'm quickly going to do a little segue. So Chernobyl, when the accident happened there and that one nuclear reactor blew up and basically there was nothing left of it and all this radiation was released, the Russian authorities, Gorbachev, organized that 900,000 soldiers, 900,000, so almost 1 million people, were mobilized to dump sand and various other, and lead and cement in trying to entomb the reactor. They only spent about 5 to 10 minutes at site, shoveling sand and shoveling cement and trying to entomb the old reactor, the reactor that was blown up and still releasing all this radiation. So they basically let 900,000 people get quite a high dose from being so close to the radiation. But it needed that many people in order to, create an entombment, a sarcophagus of that reactor. We haven't heard that at all about Japan, that they have done that. You don't hear how they're going to try to manage in trying to keep this radiation bottled up. Basically, it's still all open, and it's continuing to spill, and it's not so much more in the atmosphere through steam, but more so as the runoff from all this coolant water now, because they don't know where to put it. There's just so much of it. And so the concern is that the contamination that has now washed into the ocean, where does it go? Yes, Pacific Ocean, it's a gigantic ocean. But now they found that the debris field has been washing up much sooner in Hawaii and now soon on the West Coast than they were expecting. And when they were measuring concentrations, this is something that Greenpeace on their website, if you were to go look for that, have found is that the concentration of the water is quite concentrated. It hasn't diluted as much as it should. So the water seems to not mix as well as they were anticipating. So that means the concentration of the radiation is still quite concentrated in this stream of water that passes Japan and basically curves all the way around Alaska and down our coast. So we're going to get that radiation one way or another. And really the concern is that as it goes up the food chain, so you have, little plankton being eaten by little critters that are then eaten by little fish, and then the little fish get eaten by little bigger fish, and then the little bigger fish get eaten by bigger fish. And then eventually we got tuna and salmon at the top, and then us.
So then we are eating and drinking and being exposed to, in the air in many, many ways, radioactive particles that will enter our body and continue. They just emit radiation and will damage our bodies in many, many, many ways.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's not just one element. There are many elements that are radioactive and that come from this reactor. The only one that they ever talk about, it seems, with willingness on the media is iodine. Iodine has conveniently a half-life of 8 days. So you multiply by 10, that's 80 days. So you only have to wait 80 days for the iodine to disappear. Now, a professor at Simon Fraser University, SFU, they were measuring fairly high concentrations of iodine in seaweed just a few weeks after the accident in Fukushima.
Radioactive iodine.
Radioactive iodine.
In seaweed.
In seaweed.
Here on the West
Coast. Yes, in Vancouver. It shouldn't have, it only took a few weeks to get it here, and the only way it came here was by air.
And in the rain.
And in the rain.
I remember a week or so after the accident, or a couple of weeks after the accident, biking through downtown Victoria on a rainy day and thinking, I don't even want to think about this. That's what I was thinking, because I knew, because you'd heard.
Sure.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we have got to, do we not have to shut down nuclear power around the world? Germany, I understand, is doing that.
Yeah.
Germany has decided to move away from nuclear power?
But only because of Fukushima.
Only because of Fukushima?
Yes. It was interesting. So in Germany, because after Chernobyl, the accident there, people were not very enthusiastic about nuclear power, as you can imagine. Now, the Green Party in Germany has been anti-nuclear all its life. For 30 years now, they have been anti-nuclear, and they have not wavered from that point of view. And how you always have to repeat a message over and over and over again until it sticks. And in the most conservative state in Germany, they had elections. It's kind of like the Alberta of Germany, if you want to call it that, because Alberta I would consider a very conservative state or province. They had elections about a month after Fukushima, and the Green Party won. This has been conservative for over 40 years, this state. And the Green Party won a mandate there. And it comes down to what the federal government did. There was an agreement made by the previous government. It was a coalition government between the Liberals, I suppose, and the Green Party, if you want to give the equivalent. It was the SPD and the Green Party. They were in power with a coalition. And coalition, I know in Canada is a really evil word, but they managed to make that work for 2 mandates. And they agreed to abolish nuclear power. At a certain point in future, I think it was 2020 or something like that, or 2012. I don't remember the exact dates. But anyways, the Conservatives then were elected. So the Liberal Green coalition didn't have a mandate anymore. And the Conservatives were voted in. And the Conservatives, with the help of the industry, have been slowly but surely trying to erode this law that they had passed, this rule of basically not allowing nuclear power to continue. And they actually then changed it. They changed it and they said, okay, you know what? Nuclear power plants can be operated for another 30, 40 years. We're going to put that end date into the future. We need nuclear power was the argument. And people were extremely upset because, people remember Chernobyl. They remember this is dangerous. The radiation is still in the environment even now after 25 years. And then the federal government basically changed this because the Germans felt good about that they were going to abolish nuclear power. Then the Conservatives changed it and said, look, the industry made us an excellent deal, basically. They gave them, I forget how many billions of euros, but in promise of revenues for or in a one-time payment to the government in order for them to extend the licenses for the nuclear power industry.
We're almost out of time. Werner, thank you very, very much for doing this. I think it's something we all have to hear. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem is immense. This stuff is going to be around not only for hundreds of years, but for thousands of years, spreading death not only to people, but to every living thing on the planet. Fukushima is a disaster of unimaginable proportion. We have got to move away from nuclear power, and even more, we need some honesty from our politicians and the media. It's up to you, because certainly the power structure has betrayed us yet again. It's up to all of us to remember this disaster, not forget it, and start to do something about it. Werner, thank you very much, and thanks for watching Face to Face.